Chapter 18. More about Kulalai. When I think back to that day in Kulalai, in that grey, dilapidated building on the hill, I cannot but be glad that it has been abolished, that the present generation of cadet officers are better housed and study under better conditions than obtained when we were there. Sometimes when I see them in the Istanbul streets with their smart, dark blue uniform, the dashing red line running down their trouser legs to show that they belong to the military caste, I cannot but remember my generation's early years as cadets. That morning in May 1919, when my mother had left us and we stood there in the captain's forbidding room, awaiting his instructions, all the romance of soldiering left me. Mehmet and I stood there uncertainly, whilst the captain rustled papers on his desk and ignored us. I suppose I cried myself to sleep that night. A bugle commenced to play from the garden, low and mournful and full of sadness, its isolated loneliness. It was the one thing needed to make me feel less conscious of being far away from home, and I buried my head in the pillow and started to cry. I awoke sometime in the middle of the night, yet no noise had disturbed me, for the dark dormitory was full of gently breathing boys. Something was prickling my body like 1,000 red-hot needles, and I scratched tentatively, and as I moved my arm, something ran down it, and my flesh crawled with loathing, for my bunk was alive with bedbugs. One dropped on my face from the bunk above, and I wanted to shout out with horror for the dark things that walked by night. But eventually, I let them have their way with me and slept again, for exhaustion was stronger than fear. I awoke to a bugle playing reveille, and a duty student stripped away the blanket from me. "Open your eyes," he bawled, and I looked around me dazed, having forgotten for the moment where I was. I moved and was conscious of the stiffness, for the bunk was hard and my ribs ached. To a lesser degree, I was conscious of the swollen lumps on my legs and arms where the bugs had feasted all night. The boy in the bunk next to me told me to remove my vest, and at that moment I heard the voice of Sergeant yelling, "Lice examination." We all divested ourselves of our vests. I discovered that my body was a mass of itching sore red places. I carefully examined my vest for lice, but could discover none. Plenty of bedbugs lurked in the seams though, and I picked them off with repugnance, throwing them into the bowls of water which stood beside the lower bunks. Here they were furiously exerted their fat, swollen bodies trying to escape from the water. The boy beside me proudly showed me 2 lice he had caught, and I tried not to feel sick as he killed them, declaring to me that if one did not immediately kill the beast, they would eat one. The lively bugs still kicked in the water bowls. When the lice examination had been concluded, we were permitted to wash ourselves. Everyone made a great clatter entering and leaving the wash houses, for we all wore takunya on our feet. After dressing, with a great deal of fussiness on my part for fear vermin had embedded themselves in the seams of my jacket or trousers, we assembled in the corridor for a morning roll call. The sergeant read our names in brusque voice, and meekly we all answered to our names. We filed to the dining room for breakfast, which consisted of the black bread from the night before, a handful of black olives, and the minutest possible portion of cream cheese and thick, strong tea, milkless and not sweet enough. Afterwards, we walked in the gardens, for there was nothing else to do, but soon a bell clanged, and we had to assemble at the main gates where the sergeant awaited us. He took us to a hill at the back of the school, told us to sit down on the grass, then ordered us to undress. It was another lice examination, and I wondered how many times in a day this would continue. We all sat there in the morning sunlight, diligently searching our clothes, and I thought of my mother and how shocked she would be were she to see her eldest son sitting naked on a hill searching himself for lice. There were no lessons. The days slipped by. We continued to be ignored by the War Office and the outside world alike. They were lazy, sun-filled days, and all of us had far too little to occupy our minds or our bodies, so physical exercise was mostly in the form of fighting. I was told one day that I was to be that evening's duty student, and I did not relish the idea. We were all filled with the wildest superstitions, dread of the dead, believing that they had the power to come back to haunt us. That night, when the retiring student had gone to bed and I was all alone now in the dark, all the old fears returned to me, and it availed me nothing to tell myself that it was stupid to be afraid of the dark. It was uncannily quiet, in the way a place full of unaware sleepers always is, and I shivered a bit. The even rise and fall of their breathing was the only sound to be heard, but after a bit I heard a clock striking far away down in the well of the hall, chiming the hour. The little oil lamp flickered and seemed about to go out, but it revived again. Nothing happened that night, but I was glad beyond measure when the first pale streaks of dawn crept up from the east and finally the new day broke over the peaceful dewy garden. But the new day heralded nothing for us but half-cooked food, lice examinations, and fights. Our colossal boredom led us into troubles. There was no discipline anywhere, the captain was practically always invisible, and the War Office seemed to have forgotten us. I learned that the Kurds and the Armenians were all orphans from the east of Turkey, and that General Kazim Karabekir had collected them all and sent them to Kulalai. He was a popular general in the east, but when his wild young protégés from Anatolia arrived in Istanbul, everyone had immediately disclaimed all responsibility for them, so they rotted in Kulalai until someday someone would remember them. The same sort of thing applied to the Arabs and the Albanians, who were originally brought to Istanbul by Enver Pasha, but when he escaped from Turkey after the war was over, they too were sent to Kulalai and promptly forgotten. In the meantime, the Sultan decided that he wanted Turks from good families or the sons of officers to be schooled at Kulalai, so the War Office drew up a very magnificent but unworkable plan and ignored the fact that the school was already overrun with hordes from the east. The Turkish army was demobilized. Those who were left, the War Office did nothing, and famous officers were reduced to selling lemons in the Istanbul streets. It was hardly surprising that nobody worried about us. My mother visited us every few weeks, and when she first saw us in our baggy uniforms, she looked as if she did not know whether to laugh or cry. She asked many questions about our lessons, the sort of food we were being given, and was disposed to lump all Kurds and Armenians as murderers. Impetuously, she wanted to take us home again. She complained to the captain that the place was dirty and she did not wish to leave us here any longer. The captain, it appeared, spread his hands expressively and repeated the same old refrain that everything, of course, was still very disorganized. He then gently reminded her that she had signed contracts for us and that if we were taken home, he would be most regretfully compelled to send military police officers after us. This really frightened her, for it never occurred to her that contracts would be used against her in this fashion. Not to be entirely thwarted, however, she furiously told the captain with more spirit and accuracy that she would use her influence at the War Office to have us removed. The captain, no doubt having heard this before, remained unimpressed. My mother would come to the school unveiled, and several of the older boys said she was a tango, meaning a tart, and I became involved in many fights. I begged my mother to cover her face, and although she indignantly refused at first, nevertheless she soon gave in. One day she complained that Mehmet and I smelled, and the next time she visited us, brought perfumed soap with her. This we refused in horror, declaring that life was already sufficiently difficult for us without adding to the burden with scented soaps. Kulalai Military School proper, the big white palace fronting the Bosphor, was occupied by older boys who would eventually graduate from there to the snobbish military college in Harpia. News circulated one day that the American occupying forces were going to take over the school for the Armenians. Rumours also spread that our turn would come too, but what was to happen to all of us nobody knew, and presumably nobody cared. About this time, we heard too the first faint magic of the name Kemal Ataturk, who was gathering together an army in far-off Anatolia, who had already established a nationalist government in Ankara. The news about the Americans and the Armenians proved to be true enough, and one day we saw from our gardens the older boys of Kulalai bringing beds and mattresses and desks into the school gardens. Their evacuation was commencing. The hatred between Turk and Armenian is notorious, but that day in our grey school on the hill, the hatred was intense. The Armenians could not be held, so proud were they to receive the recognition of the Americans. They swaggered and strutted, and fights became more frequent than ever. When the American flag one morning waved over Kulalai, the Armenians went mad with joy, and the Kurds berserk with fury. A number of broken heads resulted, and the captain sticked at overtime. Our turn came afterwards. One morning we had to assemble in the main hall, the old monitors attempting to keep law and order and refusing to answer all our questions. We must have looked a rough lot standing there in our ill-fitting uniforms, our heads cropped and our faces paste-beat through bad feeding. Some American officers came in through the main gates, an Armenian priest with them, and a tall American woman with a flat bosom and severe horn-rimmed spectacles. She intimidated me far more than the officers did. A very dragon of a woman she was, who would always know what was good for one. We watched them expectantly. First they busied themselves with the older boys. Some were separated from the line, and we uncomfortably wondered what this separateness might portend. Soon they came to us, and an interpreter called out, "All Armenians, step this side." Many boys stepped forward, including our sergeant. The priest, who looked quite terrifying with his black spade beard, began to ask us questions, and the woman took matters into her own hands, apparently deciding no harm would be done were she also to do a bit of separating. She glanced at us coldly, as though all of us were so stupid that we did not know what nationality we were. Earnestly she peered into our faces, then pulled a few more boys over to the Armenian side. They were Kurds she selected, and I could not but be curious to know by what means she wished Armenian nationality on them. She peered closely at me too, but left me in the lines. Soon the selections were completed, and the Armenians were put into a large room off the hall. We were dismissed, no one having any further use for us. We eagerly ran to the garden to look through the windows of the room where lurked the Armenians. They waved happily to us, jeering and shouting rude remarks. We, not to be outdone, replied in kind. We threatened to push in their faces, and the old monitors implored us over and over again to make less noise. Suddenly, above all the shouting, I heard my name called. I recognized my brother's voice, but although I looked everywhere for him, I could not find him. His plaintive voice called and called to me, and fear broke over me, and I thrust my way to the front of the crowd, sobbingly telling him I was coming. I saw him at one of the windows where all the Armenians were, and I flew to him, stretching up and grasping his small hand. He said with hysteria in his voice, "They are taking me with the Armenians." I did not know what to do, but I clung to his cold hands until a big Armenian thrust his body between us, forcing our hands apart. I ran to a monitor, telling him what had happened, but his slowness, his indecision maddened me. I dragged him over to the American officers to explain. The interpreter pushed us aside, demanding to know how we dared disturb the lordly American ones. He would not listen to me, and I noticed that the Armenians had been formed into long lines and were being marched out of the school. I left the old monitor and the puzzled American officers and ran to the marching jubilant lines for Mehmet. Feverishly, I searched, my heart almost choking me, and when I found him I threw myself on him, holding him tightly. Someone tried to separate us, and I said, "Leave us alone, this is my brother, we are Turks, and his name is Mehmet." An Armenian jeered. "My name is Mehmet too, but what does that prove?" I pulled Mehmet out of the line, but the interpreter, who had come to see what all the commotion was about, pushed him back in again. I kicked him fiercely on the shin. "Dirty Armenian," I said, "you are taking my brother with you. He is a Turk." The American officers and the woman and the priest came up to us by this time, and the woman asked what was the matter. The interpreter apparently said that nothing was wrong, bowing himself almost double in his efforts to please her. I kicked him again, and one of the officers caught hold of me. Weakly I pummeled his chest, sobbing out the story in Turkish, which he could not understand. As a last desperate attempt to make him understand, I jerked my head towards my terrified little brother and said, "Turk, Turk." And then, as he still did not appear to understand, I searched back through the years to the fragments of French I once had known. "Il est mon frère," I said, and then he understood, and he allowed Mehmet to come to me. The woman interfered, saying something I could not understand. I was in agony to kill her, the stupid, righteous woman with the hard, cold face. "Cochon americane," I said, in desperation, and she boxed my ears, but more in sorrow than in anger, her face implying that only a Muslim, an outsider from Christianity, could say such a thing. Only a Turk, her face implied, could have used this expression. With the Armenians gone from the school, we were quieter, only the Kurds still on the lookout for a fight. We were still the merest handful of Turkish students, but the Kurds soon tired of baiting such unresponsive elements, took to escaping to the far ends of the gardens, where they could sling stones down the hill into the Kulalai gardens, where walked the Armenians. We would see them in their smart, well-fitting American uniforms, and hear the bell which called them to lessons. Still we roamed, unlessoned, undisciplined, and more warlike than ever. One day, though, the stuttering captain was replaced by a new commanding officer, and soon other officers came to the school, and lawlessness became a thing of the past. The Kurds and the Albanians and the excitable Arabs were marched out of Kulalai, and there were many of us who wondered where they went. Perhaps they flooded the streets of Istanbul in warlike waves to sleep hungry under Galata's impersonal bridge. We none of us ever knew.